The term sex ed nationalism first came to me in Beijing a few years ago. I was at a sexuality education training, listening to a Netherlands expert introduce the sex ed system in her country. Now, the Netherlands has much to celebrate about sexuality education. They have some of the lowest public health indicators, some of the best public health indicators in the world on things like teen pregnancy and teen abortion. But she was going beyond specific claims about her sexuality education system to talk about broader issues about why things had gone so well. She said it wasn't just the sex ed system, it was how parents communicated with their children about sex and in general. Netherlands parents have got it just right. They're not too authoritarian and they're not too permissive, unlike Chinese parents, she said. Then she went on to talk about pornography. Dutch teenagers like watching porn, but they know that it's not real. Whereas immigrants, when they watch porn, she said, they don't have this critical awareness. They think that pornography is real, it's something to learn from and something to emulate. And as I was listening to this, I thought, she's going beyond claims about her sexuality education system to talk about how her country is in some ways superior to others. And this is in the context of the Netherlands, where the far-right politician Geert Wilders has depicted Islamic culture as sexist and homophobic and called for the Netherlands to close its borders to asylum seekers from Islamic countries to protect Dutch women from sexual attacks. I thought, this is sex ed nationalism. Now, in a way, the UNESCO international guidelines on sexuality education are a challenge to sexuality education nationalism. They're put together by an international team based on international human rights frameworks and global evidence for a multilateral organization. But they have been critiqued by Taiwanese theorist Josephine Ho, analyzing the guidelines from a post-colonial perspective. She argues that setting up a global standard for sexuality education risks crowding out pre-existing sexual knowledge and cultures. She fears these guidelines could be used to judge countries as less civilized if their sex education doesn't meet the standards. And she objects to the lack of attention to how colonial power and global inequality have contributed to causing some of the issues discussed, like teen pregnancy and high rates of STIs. Now, whatever you think of her argument, it did have some nuance, but this nuance was completely lost when it was featured by the Chinese sexuality education Peng Xiaohui on his microblog. Peng Xiaohui is one of the most popular sex ed influencers in China, with 33 million regular users of his microblog, Xiaohui Talks Sex. And he posted Josephine Ho's argument, saying that he agreed with it because indeed China needs a Chinese sexuality education free from Western influence. And he has more recently warned, don't touch sex science without patriotism. His argument is, his rhetoric is in line with government rhetoric around nationalism and the dangers of Western influence. And it's also consistent with his other posts about, for example, how Hong Kong protesters should be more patriotic towards the mainland. So maybe this kind of sex ed nationalism should not come as a surprise to us. Sexuality education is all about values and always politically contested. And education systems often seek to inculcate the next generation into the moral order of the nation. Indeed, in Zimbabwe, sexuality education and patriotism are taught together as part of the same life skills curriculum. And in the UK, LGBT and sex education are connected with British values when taught in schools. But we sexuality educators rarely engage explicitly with these neo-colonial and nationalist discourses. Agents of Ishq is an exception. Paramita Voha explains, we mine erotic traditions of India and repurpose them for contemporary life. How do we have a contextual discussion which does not fall into the hands of the nationalists through art which can deal with the nuances? So I leave us all with a question. How do we fit with these neo-colonial and nationalist agendas? Do we comply or build alternatives?